I analysed 13,000 houses and the results genuinely shocked me because it turns out a lot of the numbers you see on property websites, including my own, are complete lies. But we're going to fix that because you're about to learn the dodgy numbers that Kiwis have been fed for years, how to tell if the property you're buying is actually above average, and how to spot when a salesperson is using bad data on you, because that way you'll know which numbers you can safely ignore when you're hunting for your next property. Now, if you go on almost any property website, you'll see an average rental return for a suburb, and it might be, let's call it 4%. Now, this is what we call the gross yield, and it tells you how much rent a property could make per year compared to its value. So if a property rents for $500 a week and it's worth $550K, then the gross yield is 4.7%. And Kiwis like this kind of data because if the suburb's average yield is 4%, you can quickly check if the property you're looking at is above or below average. And that is exactly where the problem lies, because the numbers used when calculating the average gross yield and put on property websites are completely dodgy, because all those websites take the median rent in a suburb and then they divide it by the average house price. Now that might sound reasonable, except the average property in a suburb is not the same as the average rental property. Stick with me on this, it is so important that you understand this. Rentals are typically cheaper, smaller, and older. After all, investors don't usually buy 6-bedroom mansions to rent them out. They tend to cluster at the more affordable end of the market. So when websites mix the rent from cheaper rentals with the price of every house in the suburb, including the really expensive ones, they come up with a number that actually isn't as useful as you think. It's like saying the average car costs $1.50 per K to drive, but you use how much petrol a Suzuki Swift uses divided by the price of a Range Rover. The maths works, but the numbers are nonsense. And this actually has a real risk because you might buy a property thinking you're getting an above average yield, but it turns out you're not because the data was dodgy from the start. And yes, my website does this too, and we'll get to why in a minute. But before we do, if you're going to take one thing from this video, take this. I've put together a free cheat sheet with all of the numbers I'm covering, the pros and cons of each data source, and what to actually look at when you're checking a property's yield so you don't have to take notes. Scan the QR code on your screen or hit the link down in the description. And when you grab it, you're also going to get a 9-part series of emails and videos that I've recorded from my home office. They're closer to a phone call rather than a YouTube video, and I cover the stuff I'd tell you over coffee about finding high yield properties. When you scan that QR code or click the link in the description, you'll get those as well. So if the data on pretty much every property website is dodgy, is there a way to actually get a real number so you can tell whether the property you're looking at is above or below average? Well, there is. I built a bot to scrape 12,958 rental listings off TradeMe to find out how much investors are really charging for their property in terms of rent per week. Then I got the bot to go away and check the values on every property on OneRoof so that we can see the rental return that investors are willing to accept. For instance, I looked at this 3-bed townhouse in Wellington. It's advertised for $800 a week. OneRoof reckoned it was worth $920,000, so it's got a 4.5% gross yield. My bot then did this around 13,000 times, which means that we've got data that no one else in the country has, which means that we can get around the issue that most property websites have that I just told you about. Because instead of comparing the petrol used by a Suzuki Swift with the price of a Range Rover, now we're matching each property's rent to its own value. And what we see is, rather than the average rental property getting a 3.9% gross yield, like you might see in some property reports, you can actually see that investors are getting a higher rental return. The real number is closer to 4.5%. And so if you'd been following those public averages, you might think that a $1 million property is going to make 39 grand in rent per year. But the real number is closer to $45,000. So that's an extra 6 grand a year that you didn't know you could be earning if you were evaluating rental properties. Over 10 years, that adds up to $60,000 that you could have potentially left on the table because the data was wrong and so you bought a below average property. Here's the other thing about averages. A third of Kiwis live in Auckland, which drags every national number toward whatever's happening in the big smoke, which is why national averages can actually mislead you into thinking that you're doing really well. So this is the chart I want you to screenshot. At the top, we've got Southland and Manawatu Wanganui. They've got some of the highest median gross yields in the country, and they're both at around 5.8% in terms of median gross yield. Otago's pretty good, 5.7%. Northland and Hawke's Bay, they're coming up next at 5.3%. And you can see how Auckland drags down the national average because our largest city has an average gross yield of just under 4%. Now, I don't think the takeaway from this is to say, cool, just buy in Southland, just buy in Manawatu Wanganui. Instead, it's to use these numbers to know or to figure out what an above or below average rental return looks like for your area. That's how you as a property investor can tell if you are ahead or behind the pack. Because let's say you had a property and that had a rental yield of, call it 5%. Well, that is above the national average. So you might think, well, that's a great yield. I'm going to buy that property. But if that property is in Southland, well, a 5% gross yield is below average for that region. You might be able to find a higher return property down the road. But take that same 5% yield and put that property in Auckland and pretend it still gets 5%. Well, you've just found a property that is genuinely above average, which is why if I hear investors say, well, you need to aim for a 5% gross yield or whatever number they happen to say, I think, well, it depends where you're investing, because in some regions that might be a really good yield, in others, it's rubbish. But if this data is so trash, why do I publish those numbers I just told you not to trust on my own website? Well, it's because it's really easy to calculate, and it still can be useful when you're comparing suburbs. So for instance, if you look at this map of Auckland, you can see the average rental yield for every suburb, and this is just based on the median rent and the average house price in that suburb, just like the way I told you about before. Now, you can easily see here that it's more likely that you'll find a high yield property in Mangere Bridge rather than in Herne Bay, which is the most expensive suburb in the country. But you shouldn't then look at these numbers and think, well, this tells me whether my property has a good yield or not. I'll give you an example for this. The median rent in Herne Bay is about $700 a week, and the average house is around $3 million. So if you took those numbers at face value, you'd think that you can rent a $3 million Herne Bay property for $700 a week. But you can't. Let me show you. I mean, here is a Herne Bay property that is currently online for about $1,800 a week. Now, let's check what that property's actually worth. Well, Homes estimates that's worth about $3 million. So no, you can't use that map and think that you're going to be able to get a $3 million property in Herne Bay and rent it out for $700 a week. It'd actually cost you around $1,800 to rent. And the gross yield for this property is around 3.1%, but that doesn't mean it's a good rental return just because it's higher than the average for that suburb, because as we've seen, a 3-ish% gross yield is still a pretty rubbish rental return. Now, the reason the published number says $700 a week is that most of the properties that are renting on Trade Me in Herne Bay are much smaller, much cheaper properties. For example, this one that rents for $580 a week, that's probably the average rental property in Herne Bay, but it's not the average property in that suburb because those properties tend to be larger and lived in by people with more money. And what I'm really trying to say with all of this is just to be careful with the numbers you see online, including the ones on my own website, opespartners.co.nz, because if you're trying to compare different areas to find where yields tend to be higher, this kind of data is still fine for that. But if you're trying to assess whether a specific property is a good rental, these numbers won't help you. You need numbers that fit for the purpose you want. And the whole point of this YouTube channel is to give you the data so you can be an informed investor. So when someone tries to sell you a property by saying, oh, this yield's above average, you'll know to ask, well, above which average, and was the average even calculated honestly? And if you want to see how to actually use these numbers to retire on rent, make sure you watch my boring blueprint to 10K a month from property. Click the video on your screen and I'll see you in there.